Hi everyone, and thanks for your time today at this unitized panel. So my name is Caleb, and I'm going to be moderating this session together with Benjamin as well as Vinay. Shortly, I'll let everyone start to introduce themselves, but the topic that we are going to talk about today is about the finance infrastructure in Asia in particular. So, we've had a lot of growth in the last few years. We've had a lot of promises. And today, I guess what we're going to do is to deep dive a little bit into where are we at, and what are we going to be tangibly looking for in the next couple of months. So my background is, as a short introduction, I'm from Tezo Southeast Asia, and we help to build awareness within the community for the Tezos platform, the Tezos blockchain platform. My previous background was that I used to work in data centers. I used to help manage the domain name business of one of the world's largest wholesale domain registrars. So very much infrastructure related, data center related. And obviously, being in Singapore, I was fortunate enough to grow up, with the industry as well. So today, my questions will be more evolved around, like what are some unique trends and how do we make sense of it? Not just from an industry point of view, but really how does it trickle down to the end users? So with me today, I'll start to hand over to introduce Benjamin first before Vinay. So maybe Benjamin, you can start off by a quick introduction.
Thanks. Thanks, Caleb. Thanks for having me here. So my name is Ben. I'm from Singapore. I'm the co-founder and director of Stacks, a Singapore-based blockchain company. So our company is developing and deploying live blockchain infrastructure, which consists of our own proprietary blockchain, the entire suite of APIs and front-end platforms for capital markets. So our clients are banks and stock exchanges, including national stock exchanges, global investment banks, and asset managers who are using our blockchain infrastructure to use the blockchain effectively. Yep. So that's from me.
Great. Thanks, Ben. Maybe we could go over to Vinay now.
Sure thing. Thanks, Caleb. So my name is Vinay. I'm also from Singapore, at least I'm supposed to be. I'm currently stuck in India thanks to the COVID crisis with borders closing. I'm a former management consultant. I was fortunate enough to be part of what is now known as the FinTech Wave 1 back in the early days of the 2000s. And about 5 years ago, I found myself, exploring the early stages of blockchain in Singapore. I was the founding member of Consensus Asia team and also led the Singapore office of Consensus for the past 4 years. And more recently, I'm now the chief operating officer of a payments infrastructure startup called Enzia. And interestingly enough, also using blockchain. So my sort of evolution has been to see the more traditional, thick-client, crude platform style fintech, which emerged 20 years ago, and more recently with a focus on blockchain and enterprise and public sector blockchains in particular.
Oh, that's a lot of experience, so we'll definitely will be asking you for a lot of opinions as we start tackling the questions. Great. So without further ado, maybe I'll just start off this, whole discussion by asking everyone, like we've often talked about the state of finance infrastructure and this term finance infrastructure, like, is it new? Is it something that inherently is very different, because like obviously, Ben, you've been involved in setting up infrastructure for corporates. How does that differ, be it a cloud solution or be it a bare metal solution? And what are kind of the factors that have led to this growth within Asia?
Yeah, so finance infrastructure is definitely different from what we would call traditional or other types of infrastructure, quite basically because the capital markets is highly regulated. So many of the institutions that we're dealing with, they have very strict requirements on how, for example, data is handled. For example, what open source license are they using? Okay, an example, what code, okay, goes into the platform itself. So they are really scrutinizing every single detail, such that it's actually form a kind of like a operations model whereby it is largely very conservative. Okay, so the problem about this, of course, as you might know, is that the financial institutions are mostly using very dated software, because such technologies are usually very established. They have gone through a long process to be able to so-called certify them. And back to your question about finance infrastructure and Asia, quite frankly, the Asian capital markets is definitely younger than the US or European capital markets. So that's why you see that most of the technology providers in the traditional capital market space are usually from Europe or the US. Yeah, so even in banks in Asia or stock exchanges in Asia, we are all going to use this what we call Western technology even today. So that is quite different from the rest of the infrastructure of other industries out here in Asia, where we see a lot of growth and innovation in Asia in the traditional infrastructure, like for example e-commerce, for example digital payments, telcos, right? Okay, a lot of investments and a lot of innovation have been made in these industries in Asia, even more so than in America or Europe. But conversely, for finance, we are still using a lot of the existing incumbent software that originated from there.
Right. Yeah, thanks for your input. Vinay, do you think that's symptomatic of like because there's technology transference, or is it awareness, or is it governments more within the region are more willing to push these things? What's triggering these?
I think it's all of the above. But just to take a big step back, and I want to build on what Ben was saying earlier. I think there's a direct proportionality between maturity of finance infrastructure, as we call it, and the political landscape of the region, right? So if you think about it, Asia is politically perhaps less mature than, let's say, the EU common market or North America for that matter. Right? These are established economic centers that have retained much of their current shape and much of their current legislation and their interworkings for more than 200 years at least, right? So, whereas Singapore, for example, found its independence and its sovereignty not too long ago. India, another major world economic center and a center of finance infrastructure, is also a young country. Old regions, young country. That's the difference I'm trying to make. So we cannot forget the political backdrop under which Asia itself has emerged, and I think that has largely guided the maturity of Asian financial infrastructure. Because if you look at it, if you look at all of the infrastructure that we have today, whether it's central banking infrastructure, capital market infrastructure, it's all started with publicly owned, government regulated, and almost government owned platforms and infrastructure. It's the steady breaking down of that, and to the point where we're now talking about peer-to-peer infrastructure. We're talking about private markets. We're talking about how SMEs can potentially become money transfer businesses. All of that was very centralized, if you think about it. So it is also the age of the political landscape, in my view, which determines the maturity of infrastructure. But that said, Asia is a very, very complex, and we quite easily associate Asia as one region, but it's such a complex marketplace. If you think about Asia, you have Saudi Arabia on one side, you have the Arctic Circle of Russia on the other side, you have Papua New Guinea over here. So it's in that triangle that we talk about the context of Asian finance, and it's such a vast spectrum. So it's very hard to actually say that Asia has happened because of the following reasons. You have Singapore, trying example of maturity in finance on one side, and then you have, let's say, Jordan, which is a totally different part of the world, also Asian. Let's not forget, but they hardly show up in the mainstream narrative. So I would say that what we're seeing in Asia is the resurgence of the way individual nations want to reinvent finance, and I think a lot of it is guided by political and economic maturity individually. It is very hard for us to talk about Asia collectively, because let's be honest, there isn't one common market called Asia. ASEAN is the closest we have to that. So it's going to be very hard to characterize Asian maturity as a whole. I think it's important, and this is perhaps a slightly contrarian view that I will take, that we talk about, individual country-wise development, or perhaps even more, region-wise development.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like Asia, as you've mentioned very accurately, is so huge, and everywhere is, even different countries are trying to carve out their own unique niche areas, based on their strengths and their various policies. What do you think, or which country do you think is currently, or countries even have a good plan for building applications on top of their financial infrastructure?
Well, it's the easy answer there is Singapore, simply because if the operative word is which country has the best plan, I think Singapore, hands down, is a shining example of how Asian planning, or Asia-centric planning and planning from Asia is working really well. Because not only is the country looking at maturity of its own finance infrastructure, Singapore has pretty much led the way for a lot of cross-border initiatives, a lot of transnational initiatives, simply because it's been such an open-to-trade country throughout its life. And also, it's got exceptional planning capability, exceptional application of technology. And perhaps what it lacks is the gateway to a major market like what Hong Kong has with China, or a backyard like Indonesia, which is a huge volumes market. But I think in terms of planning and in terms of preparation and in terms of the evolution of fintech and financial infrastructure, Singapore is definitely up there. But the shining lights for me in Asia would be all the usual suspects. So we talk about Asia, we talk about China, we talk about Singapore, India, Japan, and Korea for their own reasons in terms of the way they evolve. But I think the trick for finance infrastructure in Asia and its maturity is how quickly can we jump from what we have into perhaps saying what can we do now to extend the same sort of facilities that are available in Singapore in Myanmar, which incidentally is another great story to talk about separately. But that is important, and that's why Asia is so diverse and so fragmented. You don't have a state of maturity that's consistent across these countries. They're all very different. But yeah, Singapore is definitely one that comes to mind.
Okay. Ben, what do you think about the applications that you're seeing people build on these infrastructure? Do they vary from country to country? Do they are they driven by certain initiatives within the respective country governments, or like are you seeing like groups of people coming together, banding together because they're trying to tackle some problems?
Yeah. So I absolutely echo Vinay's point. And to answer your question, yes, a lot of these governments or different countries, they are actually aligned for the common objective. The way that they might get there might be different, or the focus on a certain industry might be different. But basically, they are all focused on one thing, which is digitalization. And also adding on to Vinay's point, ASEAN, while it's younger, or Asia, while it's younger, I'd like to bring the focus on ASEAN, Southeast Asia, or ASEAN +3, okay, because I think this is the closest we have to a kind of a regional partnership. And it's really quite interesting that many of these countries, ASEAN +3, I mean, it's a huge population, it's 850 million, disregarding China, it's 850 million people, it's highly digital. There's a lot of technologies that are being adopted right now in these countries. And the most interesting thing is that because we do not have as many legacy inefficiencies as the more mature markets, even in Singapore, many of our existing infrastructure are considered new, okay, as opposed to the European or American markets. So such that we are quite able, quite nimble enough to, okay, replace some of the processes with new ones, and of course some of the infrastructure with new ones. So I think that there's been quite a lot of effort from a top-down approach. Okay, so answering you, Caleb, okay, what are type of the applications that's being built right now? I do see a lot of governments and central agencies getting involved from a top-down approach, and there is a really good hope that one day we might be able to have a harmonized market in ASEAN +3, okay, using the same form of infrastructure. So maybe perhaps even rivaling something like the EU, because the EU is another example of a common market that we can see. So over 20 countries in one single market. Okay, possibly, quite possibly, we might even have something like this in ASEAN plus 3. It's not for us to say, but at the very least, in terms of technology, we could create a standard such that each country, while retaining its own jurisdiction and regulatory rights, okay, they may be able to have a cross-border trading market, okay, on the same standards. Yeah, so that's something that I see as very promising, and that's being led by many governments right here.
Right. Yeah. And so, like, one thing that I'm also quite keenly aware of is, the Singapore government's initiatives around electronic invoicing. That could be one example of how, a government is trying to take the lead, but it's not necessarily just a nationwide effort, because if you digitalize enough within the country itself, then it also facilitates future cross-border trade. So that's kind of that first thing that came to my mind as you were talking about different applications, especially from top down. I want to quickly build on this point, because we've been talking about infrastructure in terms of maybe hardware, in terms of technology, and I kind of want to get everyone's opinion around, are we missing other soft factors, things like legislation, things like recognizing central bank digital currencies, things like looking into how ready people are to embrace electronic wallets, and is there anything that's preventing applications that have been built to really go out mass market, and to gain massive adoption? So the kind of example I'm trying to bring everyone to relate to is like, in the good old days of when Skype first launched, everyone thought this is a new way to make calls, and obviously there were regulatory barriers. There were a lot of challenges in terms of even the underlying bandwidth, whether the pipes were capable of carrying high fidelity audio over the internet. So I kind of want to liken that example to what we are going through now. We might have the infrastructure, but what are we missing, to allow anyone and everyone to embrace a financial world that it's built on top of this infrastructure? So that's kind of like an open question for anyone to answer.
So interestingly, I actually think, oh, sorry, Vinay, you go first.
Oh, go for it, please.
Oh, okay. So interestingly, I actually think that where we are right now, we are the closest, to getting the new DLT infrastructure in place as the main infrastructure for finance. Because if you ask me, besides Switzerland in EU, for example, I don't think there's any other comparable jurisdiction that's as supportive as Singapore and of course ASEAN. I mean, it's not just Singapore. If you look around us, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, there's been various efforts by various entities and governments, okay, to push through the use of DLT, and of course Hong Kong, China, Japan, and Korea. So I do think that where we are right now, we are actually in the location that's closest to having widespread use of the blockchain. But of course, okay, when you're talking about real massive adoption, okay, in the masses, I do think it has to be driven by institutions rather than, on the B2C level. One reason why we are working with banks and institutions is because when we influence a bank, okay, so the bank, if it's on the blockchain, okay, all the users will be actually on the blockchain without them knowing it. Okay, so the approach that we see that will be taking off in the near run is that where these institutions representing millions of end users are actually on the blockchain. And they are actually, if I'm holding a bank account today, I don't really have anything in my wallet. The wallet is inside the bank, right? So similarly, if I have a blockchain-based wallet or blockchain-based account, okay, actually, if it's in the bank, okay, all the currencies are in the bank. So that's the closest to getting efficiencies done, okay, using the same DLT infrastructure, just that the portal is still the existing gateways that we know. Of course, that's just the first step, okay, to have a real propagation of the blockchain technology in all the use cases around us. Okay, I do think that is a necessary first step before we can evolve further.
Yeah, and just to build on Ben's excellent points there, we have to keep in mind that Asia will always be a volume game. Asia is not small, like we've discussed. It's the most populous region in the world, and the more we can enable democratized finance access to SMEs and to retail users, I think the better off finance infrastructure maturity in Asia is going to be. And this is why blockchain and DLT and CBDC in particular becomes very interesting, because what Bitcoin did in terms of providing an elegant way of managing value without having to go through the really complex piping network that's been evolved over the last 100 years, that's now being taken by central banks and applied. And just to give you an example, NZA is building one of the world's first CBDC projects in the Bahamas. Very interesting use of CBDC technology to enable ownership of value at the lowest levels. And this is important, I think, for developing economies, especially because, as Ben mentioned earlier, there is no legacy, there is no baggage in one sense, and there's an opportunity for nations like in the ASEAN region, Cambodia, for example, or Myanmar. They can completely leapfrog a lot of the effort put in by more advanced nations in creating technology by using something like blockchain. But ultimately, the aim should not be let's try and use blockchain because it's cool, or let's try and do CBDCs because it's cool. There's a need for a fundamental assessment or reassessment of the philosophy of money and why we're doing this. If we can achieve some degree of accessibility at the SME and retail user level, I think that for me is the magic ingredient for Asia. Because let's not forget, that is a big part of what makes Asia move. It's the sheer volume of people, it's the population, and also the unbanked SME. 70% of Southeast Asian SMEs struggle with digital options and banking access. That needs to change really quickly. And I think that sort of fundamental infrastructure is what's required to be in place.
Right. Yeah. I just want to quickly pick on the point you've mentioned about rethinking currencies, and that's kind of what the promise of Bitcoin was initially. So, like even opening it up to the masses, not having central intermediaries and control mechanisms. Now, how does that really fit in with the whole? We've just talked about a while ago, the whole concept of governments are now the ones that are leading this initiative, this rollout. So is there a balance? Is there in between that we have to be aware of?
Yes, but again, I think it's important we contextualize this, right? So as somebody who's grown up in Asia, worked in Asia, sort of seen the emergence of fintech and infrastructure in Asia, I've never had this problem with government leading initiatives. I'm also a very passionate crypto enthusiast. I understand where perhaps a Bitcoin maximalist might come from, saying, Satoshi Nakamoto's vision, which is central banking has failed and we need to build a new kind of payment settlement system. I don't necessarily buy into that view too much. And this, I think, is the stark difference between an Asian way of thinking, if I can call it that, and a more Western school of thought, in that we actually need government in Asia, in many parts of Asia. Saying that down with government and there's no way the government should be doing this is extremely detrimental to the cause of the people. So it's philosophically very different, first of all. From my vantage, I think it's absolutely the right thing that we have government working on this from day one. As long as you believe that money is a sovereign privilege or a privilege extended by the powers that be, and not something that the people of the world just perceive for themselves, you are pretty much stuck with a government-centric view of finance, and it's important the government gets on board. We're seeing this. We're seeing this happen at scale in India. We're seeing it happen in China. We're seeing it happen, beautifully in Singapore, which is a shining example of how public-private partnership can work in finance infrastructure maturity, where cloud computing as such a fundamental need is literally driven by the government. Imagine if we didn't have that in Singapore, for example. Imagine if we suddenly opened up Singapore and said government will no longer be involved. What would that do to our systems? So I think it's fundamental that the ecosystem be centered around a regulator first and a government first approach. It's dangerous for us to even assume that we can do this exactly like how Bitcoin was assumed. But to your question, Caleb, I think the balance is forming, and I think it's forming beautifully in Asia. Singapore, again, is a great example of how government does not try and overstep its mark, but at the same time is there as a silent support in the background. And I think it can lead to something very beautiful. And this is why Asia is exciting. This is why I think the eyes need to be on the region, because CBDC again is a culmination of that kind of thinking. It takes the best of what Bitcoin had to offer, and it builds a better kind of native money supply system, something that hasn't been tried before. And that's exactly the sort of balance that I think we'll see happening.
Yes, absolutely agree. I also think that there is a balance forming already in the sense that these are entirely two different use cases too. If you talk about a peer-to-peer money transfer service versus a securities or capital markets use of money, it's entirely two different business models altogether, and we can definitely coexist. I mean, even in Singapore, we all see that how Temasek has so-called participated in Libra, which is a classic, I would say, a retail coin that will be coming, I don't know when, sometime soon. But at the same time, we are also participating in the MAS project Ubin, where it's the foundation of a future CBDC. So that's something that can coexist because it's quite frankly for different use cases, where one is on a larger scale commercial application, industry application, while the others could be more on a retail money transfer type of service.
Right. Yeah.
Yep.
So what I'm really hearing also is like, that it's always healthy to have some form of clarity, in terms of government-led initiatives. But it also doesn't mean that, it's going to swing all the way to the other extreme, which is what some people are fearing because they see more of these initiatives being rolled out.
Yeah.
Okay, so I wish we could continue this because the discussions are very, very intriguing and I'm learning a lot as well. But in view of time, I just want to wrap things up by asking everyone one question, which is that in your mind, what do you think is an application that's ready, to take advantage of the infrastructure that's right here, right now? Or maybe it's already an application that's already there that you like and you see as a shining example of how this financial infrastructure can unlock the next potential. So, is there something in your mind that you can immediately bring up?
Yes. So personally, we have been involved in providing a digital ledger for different institutions in different countries, so such that they are able to have the same information at the same time. So this will actually allow them on the various different use cases to be able to harmonize the information. And this is actually very critical, especially when we talk about finance or capital markets, because a single piece of missing or wrong information can actually lead to losses of a few millions or even more dollars. So this is something that we'll be working on, and it's actually live in production right now, a platform where multiple banks and institutions are sending trade information in real time, noting all the previous points that we mentioned about the finance infrastructure being relatively young, and the various banks and brokers in this industry having different locations and different systems. Now they are able to harmonize all of it together under one shared ledger, which I think is the classic use case of a blockchain.
Perfect.
Yeah, I echo that completely, and I'd love to say CBDC and blockchain-based payments, but the question was about readiness and maturity and something that's ready to go. Open banking on cloud is something that Singapore has led the way for a long time now. It's tried to proliferate this technology throughout Southeast Asia. I think it's worked to some degree. And this is why we need more political will and capital behind these sorts of movements, for governments to work together to build, systems, transnational systems on open banking, for example. I think that infrastructure is there. It's available. It's ready to go, and it should really be deployed in greater degrees. But yeah, that's the instant available answer. But I'd love to see how blockchain can be a bigger part of the Asian success story.
Great, perfect. So so thanks for everyone's very healthy discussion today. I wish we had more time, but I think we're on to something for sure. Everyone has brought up very good points that I'm sure like a lot of viewers would have more questions on. So we're going to wrap up now. Thank you again, everyone, for your time. I hope that we can catch up when this whole thing is blown away and we can all come out for a nice drink together.
Thank you, Caleb. Thank you, Vinay.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks, Benjamin.
Thanks. Thank you.